Hi everyone, this is POS 201, Lecture 7 on Adam Smith and the Philosophical Foundations of Capitalism. So today we shift our focus a little bit. Thus far we've been reading about kind of the fundamental questions of politics, most recently with Hobbes and Locke. We've been talking about obligation and liberty. Before that we were talking about strategies to maintain power in Machiavelli, and started off the course with debates about the nature of justice and the ideal form of justice in Socrates and the Republic. And what we haven't really talked about yet is the interaction between politics and this one very important aspect of our lives, which is the structure of the economy. So over the next few classes, we're going to be talking about that quite a bit. And we look at a number of different approaches and positions with regard to how that ought to be structured. But we start today by looking at the philosophical foundations on which our current economic system in the United States, capitalism, is structured. And one of the intellectual forefathers of this system of economic organization is a very influential Scottish economist and philosopher named Adam Smith. And you read excerpts from Smith's Wealth of Nations for today's lecture. So, and this is a really kind of important part of the class. When I started teaching this class, I guess about 6 years ago, we had just experienced the financial collapse. So that would have been about 2008. We had just experienced this potential collapse of the financial sector. It was an interesting time to be teaching political theory, and so I incorporated this explicit focus on economic theory and economic thinkers. And I've kept that in the class because some of the issues with regard to the economy really haven't gone away. We averted a total economic collapse in 2008, and so the banking sector did not entirely crumble, but we're still kind of feeling the reverberations of that. We haven't really recovered to the extent that that I think many would have hoped by now. And so we're in a weird kind of precarious economic situation, and so we do focus quite a bit on economic thought in here and some of the intellectual foundations for core economic ideas. But so we focus on capitalism in here, and we also move on to socialism. And socialism is kind of an alternative to capitalism. But before we talk about where capitalism comes from philosophically, I actually wanted to discuss a bit what it means to reside in a capitalist society. And I always say at the outset, before we start talking about capitalism or socialism, there's really no economic system in the world, including our own, that's informed by a single set of ideas or principles. So it's pretty rare that you would find a purely capitalist system or a purely socialist system. Even in our own system, which is very much informed by the ideas of capitalism, there are some significant elements that are drawn from socialism and kind of integrated into the capitalist structure. So as we discuss this, it's important to keep that in the back of your head that, yeah, we are a capitalist society, we have a capitalist economy, but there will be things that we'll talk about in the context of socialism that apply to our own society. And so we're not purely capitalist. So what we'll do today, what we'll cover in this lecture, I want to talk a little bit at the outset just about what capitalism is. I think most of you have probably have some sense of what capitalism is, and you know some of these concepts and some of these ideas and what capitalism looks like in practice because you've lived in a capitalist society, and I imagine almost all of you have worked in a capitalist society. So some of this will be familiar, but I always kind of just define some basic concepts and basic ideas before we start to talk about the theory of capitalism and the philosophy of capitalism. So we'll start there, and then we talk about Adam Smith, the man, right? You read this individual, you read his thought. He's kind of an interesting guy. He is kind of quirky, kind of eccentric, so we'll talk a little bit about just who he was and what he was like, and kind of add some concrete detail and context to what he was doing philosophically. And then we examine the philosophical justifications for some of the core capitalist concepts, some of the things that are ubiquitous to capitalist systems. We'll talk about, okay, what is the philosophy behind them? And lastly, we'll flesh out the implications of this view for the role and the structure of government. Okay, so to start off, talk a little bit about capitalism. Usually when I teach this course in the classroom, I do this in the context of discussion, and it's always striking to me how much students, whether they're aware of it or not, whether they've systematically thought about capitalism, how they have the language, they're familiar with the language of capitalism even before reading Adam Smith. Like long before you read the philosophical treatise that's laying out some of these core ideas, students are familiar with this. But capitalism really, that's not surprising, because capitalism is the prevailing mode of economic organization in the United States and really in the world. For a time, let's say the 20th century, there was a period in which there was a kind of two different economic models, and they were in competition with one another. So you had a capitalist mode of economic organization, and that was what we saw in the United States and Western Europe and other parts of the world. But then you also had a socialist or a communist model. And so this is a different mode of economic organization that we saw in places like the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, right? And they were competitors, and it was very much in question who would win, what would be the dominant system that would eventually kind of become a global economic system. And really by the 1980s, late 1980s, the socialist mode of organization, that kind of socialist economic model, was in decline, and by the 1990s it completely collapsed. The Soviet Union fell apart. Many of the communist societies in Eastern Europe transitioned to a capitalist system, and so capitalism really today is the prevailing mode of economic organization. There are some states that exist in the world that refer to themselves as communist or socialist, but even those states often have significant capitalist elements that are integrated into them. So China is the core example. China still refers to itself as a communist state. It says it has a communist system of economic organization, but really since the 1970s, China has been integrating elements of capitalism, and it's no longer a pure socialist or communist state. You also have countries in Western Europe and Northern Europe, so countries like France or Sweden and Norway, and they have significant elements of socialism integrated into their economies, but they are really, I mean, they're integrated into the global economy. They have private economic enterprise, and so they're fairly capitalist as well. So I say that just to make clear that capitalism is really, it's the dominant mode of economic organization in the world today. So what are some of the characteristics of the capitalist economic system then? Well, capitalism is premised on the idea that markets, what we call markets, which markets are simply decentralized relations between buyers and sellers. Markets ought to be the determining force behind decisions, economic decisions regarding production, cost, and allocation. So how much is going to be produced of a certain product, what its cost is going to be, and where it's going to go. And when we say markets, it's really important that the way that we use the term markets does not mean a physical structure. So it's not like Shaw's or Hannaford, right? That is not a market in the way that we're using it here. It's more markets as relationships. Relationships between producers and consumers. And capitalism is premised on the idea that this decentralized network of interaction between buyers and sellers, that's the most efficient way to determine how much of something you ought to be producing, what you ought to be producing, what it ought to cost, and where you allocate your resources, right? As opposed to some sort of external entity telling you that markets can do a lot of that work. And so a lot of really important decisions occur through this process of interaction that occurs with markets. Kind of corollary to that, something that goes along with that, is terms that I'm sure that you've all heard, supply and demand, right? The power of markets really is that this is a setting in which forces of supply, so what is being supplied, and demand, what is being demanded, can shape the provision of goods, also wages, right? So it plays into labor as well, and how much someone is being paid for what they're doing, and the availability of products, right? So we talk about supply and demand quite a bit when we talk about prices of commodities. In the summertime, for instance, there's usually this spike in gas prices, and one of the reasons that is more people are traveling in the summer, and so there is a spike in demand, and there's tends to be less supply. And because you have a scarcity of a resource there, that can drive the price up. So prices fluctuate in relation to supply and demand. And a capitalist would look at that and say, that's perfect. That's the markets doing what they ought to do. That's how they ought to operate. Prices kind of shift in response to supply and demand. But while that's true of commodities, so things like gasoline, it's also important to keep in mind that you yourself, in a capitalist economy, you are a commodity, right? You become a commodity. So you are ultimately, when you're working in a capitalist commodity, you are selling your labor, and you are being paid via wages, right? And wages can fluctuate in relation to supply and demand. So I can give you guys a very kind of personal anecdote, but one of the critiques of the university system which you are all partaking in right now, is that there's not enough attention paid to supply and demand in terms of the training and the education of students. So employers, the people that are potentially going to buy the commodity that is you, right, that are going to employ you and pay you for a job, need certain skills, and they're demanding certain attributes and qualifications, and universities, some would argue, are too slow to respond to those forces of supply and demand. So we train students in certain skills, and they're not necessarily useful in terms of the economy that they go out and face, and so then you have unemployment, right? Which, in effect, what you have there in a capitalist economy is a surplus, right? You have a surplus of people that have certain skills, certain qualities that are not in demand. And so while supply and demand can mean surplus in terms of goods, if the car makers are manufacturing a car and people don't like it, they don't think it's well designed, they think it's it consumes too much gas and it's not fuel efficient enough, there will be a surplus of products, right? There will be a surplus of those cars, but it relates to human beings as well. And anytime you have unemployment, what you have is a surplus of human beings who are not in demand, who are not being demanded by the current labor market. So the key thing about capitalism is it takes all sorts of goods and turns them into commodities that operate according to supply and demand. And that's the case with cereal and peanut butter and toothpaste and things that you buy in the supermarket, but it's also the case with human beings. It's also the case with things like education or healthcare. In a purely capitalist society, those things as well are supposed to operate according to supply and demand, and they're supposed to be commodities that we pay for, right? That we assign a price to, and supply and demand are going to dictate what the cost will be for those goods. Okay. Kind of as an extension of these ideas, so markets and supply and demand, capitalism, the capitalist mode of economic organization, tends to be one in which proponents of capitalism say that there ought to be limited government intervention. The government ought to regulate economic affairs as little as it possibly can. Because you have these markets, because you have these decentralized relations between buyers and sellers, and those are pretty good at determining where goods ought to go, what they ought to cost, how they ought to be produced, right? You actually don't need extensive government intervention in the economy or extensive regulation by the government of the economic realm. It's the markets which are going to produce the best, most efficient result. And to the extent that you incorporate the government, if the government is very actively intervening in the economy, that will result in inefficiency. That will result in what are often referred to as market distortions. Okay, so this is an economic system that calls for limited government intervention and limited regulation in economic affairs. Now, almost every capitalist is going to allow some role for government. They think that it's important that the government exists, for instance, to regulate property and to protect property rights. The property that people own has to be protected by some entity, and that entity is the government. They generally accept, a capitalist would generally accept the idea that there needs to be some government role for taxation. Right? The government has to be able to collect revenue, although most capitalists would say not too much. If you tax too much, that again, it creates distortions in the market. But they accept the idea that there should be a government and it should have some function, but that it should be relatively limited. And then lastly, and this ties back to some of the ideas that we're talking about with the Enlightenment and liberalism, but capitalism, the capitalist idea, emerges from the Enlightenment period. And so some of the core assumptions that drive the Enlightenment in terms of political thought, right? And so some of the things that we saw in like Hobbes and Locke, they carry over to economic thought when we talk about capitalism. So capitalism is very much focused on the individual, and it's focused on the individual's autonomy and the role of individual rationality in making good decisions and using resources effectively. So for capitalism, everything is based around the idea of self-interest. You have to create a situation in which self-interest and ultimately competition, right? Competition between individuals, competition between individual firms, that will be the driver for innovation. That will result in new products, new ideas, right? And self-interest and competition also become the driver for the best use of limited resources. So we're always going to face scarcity. We're always going to come up against the limitations of certain goods. We can't provide every good infinitely to every single person, but self-interest and competition can enable us to make good decisions about the use of limited resources. It forces us to think about our own limitations and try and find ways around some of those scarcities. And that is very much in line with this idea of, give the individual a certain degree of freedom and everyone will be better off as a result. So there are Enlightenment ideas embedded within capitalism. And Adam Smith, who you read, he was writing during the Enlightenment. He was part of what was called the Scottish Enlightenment. He was in Scotland. So I think most of that people probably know, right? You're probably familiar with a lot of those ideas. having lived in a capitalist society. Things like supply and demand, you have some familiarity with those ideas and those concepts. But I just lay this out systematically so we have an understanding of what we're discussing when we talk about capitalism. And Adam Smith really provides the foundation for a lot of the capitalist ideas which will be put into practice in the centuries after he wrote. He wrote in 1776, but we've seen his ideas, his philosophy, integrated into the institutions and the practices of our capitalist economy today. So all of that really is just kind of by way of introduction. I'll talk a little bit about Adam Smith the man. Adam Smith he's a fascinating guy, a brilliant guy, and I give you just a little bit of context to give you a sense that the guy who is writing this philosophy, which can be a little bit dry and can be a little uninteresting, was actually a really fascinating and interesting guy himself. Smith was, as I said, he's another figure that we associate with the Enlightenment period. He was born in Scotland and he lived in the 18th century, so he lived in that time period in which the Enlightenment ideas were really taking root in Western Europe. He was born in 1723 in Kirkcaldy, which is a small port city near Edinburgh in Scotland. And from an early age, he was an excellent student, right? He was clearly brilliant. He studied at the University of Glasgow, which is a very highly regarded university, and eventually he went to Oxford University, which was and is still, one of the best academic institutions in the world. It's funny because despite the fact that we consider Smith the father of capitalist economics, Smith never would have called himself an economist. Economics actually did not exist as a separate area of study or area of expertise at the time that Smith was writing. He never took a class in something called economics. He never held a university post in economics. He was trained in moral philosophy, and he considered himself a philosopher. And most of the areas that we have today in the universities, so things like economics, psychology, political science, those were considered subfields, parts of philosophy at the time. So people who called themselves philosophers today would have been more specialized, and they would have been labeled economists or psychologists or political scientists. But at the time he was writing it simply didn't exist yet. So most of the early foundational economic texts are written by people that would not have called themselves economists. They would have called themselves philosophers. That's the case with Marx, who we read next time. Marx considered himself a philosopher, not an economist. Adam Smith was just kind of personal anecdotes, and you may have seen this in the picture at the start of the PowerPoint, but he was a strange-looking guy. He had this large nose and very large eyes. He had a lower lip that protruded, and he spoke with a speech impediment as a result. And he was also kind of quirky. He was notoriously absent-minded. And there's a funny story about Smith that gives you a sense of how absent-minded he was. He was the quintessential absent-minded professor. As he began to study commerce and business, as he was preparing to write The Wealth of Nations, he was doing research. And there is this section in The Wealth of Nations in which he's talking about like a pin factory he went to, right? And he was talking about the division of labor within the pin factory. You had certain individuals, and their task was to draw the wire, and other individuals whose task it was to cut the wire. And so he was going to different economic enterprises, different businesses, different merchants, to see how they operated and to see what worked, what kind of the best practices were on which we could create a philosophical system. And he went to a tanning factory in Glasgow, Scotland, a tannery. And if you're not familiar with what a tannery is, When you buy leather, like say you buy a leather sofa or a leather jacket, so that's an animal skin that has been treated and dyed and subjected to all sorts of different treatments so that it, is no longer resembles an animal skin, but it's something that's, you know, that's physically appealing and that you would want to touch, and it will not rot and smell, right? And it's not a particularly pleasant process. Like what goes on at a tannery is kind of horrifying. You basically have a bunch of animal carcasses hung up, and they're being dumped in different vats of chemicals, treated, soaked, dried out, and it's a dirty business, right? And Adam Smith was touring this tanning factory, and the tanning factory was set up in such a way that it had a platform. This was innovative and unique at the time, but there was a platform that was over the factory floor of the tannery, where management and supervisors could walk above the workers and observe what they were doing, and kind of keep an eye on things. Like I said, fairly common today. If you've ever been to a factory floor, you've worked in a factory, you've seen something like this. But at the time, this was very unique, and so Smith was interested in it. And he's being taken on a tour of this factory, and he would go on these tangents. And so he's talking about whatever it was, the merits of free trade or how to organize production on a factory floor, and he's not paying attention to where he's walking, and he actually falls off a platform directly into this huge, disgusting vat of goop, of chemicals and animal carcasses, and they were tanning animal skins in order to make them into leather, and falls into this incredibly toxic stew that's below him. And they had to pull him out. They had to strip him. They covered him with a blanket. And from that day forward, Adam Smith would claim that he was never the same physically or mentally, that this experience completely messed him up. So an interesting guy, a strange-looking guy, kind of behaved sort of strangely. But despite his strange appearance and his absent-mindedness, he was loved as a professor. He held a university post at the University of Glasgow, where he had studied, and students would come from all over to study with Adam Smith, from Moscow, from other places in Europe. So he was really highly regarded as an intellectual, and he was not simply limited to commerce and trade and economics. He didn't simply write about those topics. He also wrote quite extensively about morality and moral decision making, and he wrote about passions and human emotion, and actually anticipated a lot of later developments in psychology and what would become psychoanalysis. And today, ultimately, was what is being transitioned to kind of a science of the mind, but cognitive neuroscience, how the brain works, right? Adam Smith wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he lays out some of those things. And he begins actually to write about commerce and to write about trade, largely due to boredom and also out of a sense of moral duty. This is an era, a time in the world in which goods are still not getting to people who need them. We're still seeing famine and starvation in Europe, despite the fact that it's growing economically, and there are resources that could potentially feed people, and people don't have to starve. They don't have to be subjected to famine. And so he had this sense of how can we structure the world in such a way that we can take care of people's needs? And he wanted to develop an economic system that would be able to do that. So it was partly boredom and partly a sense of moral duty, but this was not really his specialty. This was something that he took up in addition to his specialty. And obviously he's best known for his masterwork on economics and trade, which he wrote fairly late in life, The Wealth of Nations. He wrote this in 1776. And again, he was writing simply because he was bored and felt this sense of moral duty to write it. And it was an instant hit. Unlike many of the works of political philosophy which we've read in this class, lots of people read this while Adam Smith was alive, and while he was actively working on his philosophy and developing these ideas, his work was well known. Ultimately, this is a book on how nations ought to structure their economies if they desire prosperity. But it offers us insights on human nature. It offers us insights on the proper role for government in the economy. And it makes a powerful argument for why we should create and embrace those decentralized systems of interaction, which are called markets, as the basis for mutual prosperity. So that would ultimately be his masterwork, and still, even today, probably his most widely read work. And he would die about 14 years after its publication, and on his deathbed, which this is kind of amazing because he's a guy that produced so much in his life and was so highly regarded at the time he died. But on his deathbed, he said that he wished he had been able to accomplish more in his life. Right? So he still had this sense in which there were more questions to ask, there were more things to figure out, and he hadn't done a very good job of that. Right? He could have done more. So a very fascinating guy, and an incredibly influential thinker, probably one of the most influential thinkers we've read in this class in terms of how his ideas subsequently influence history and how they continue to influence the lives that we live and the societies in which we live today. So we'll start by talking about the foundations of capitalism. As I said, capitalism is very much in that liberal tradition. Remember, liberal as we use it in the context of political theory, liberal in terms of its focus on individual liberty. That's an important part of what Smith is arguing. Capitalism, as he articulates it, is rooted first and foremost in the value and capacity of individual decision-making. So individuals as such, so consumers and entrepreneurs, but also individual firms, individual economic enterprises. It assumes, Smith's work assumes, that individuals are the best judges of their own interests. That is very much in line with the Enlightenment and liberalism. And Smith is distrustful of collectivities. He's distrustful of the state. He's distrustful of churches. He is distrustful of large collective entities stepping in and telling individuals what they ought to be doing. So why does the individual take precedence over the collectivity? Well, remember that liberalism assumes at its core that individuals are the best judges of what is in their own interest. And through the pursuit of our separate self-interest, we are said to introduce, Smith says, positive benefits, positive net benefits for society as a whole. Right? So Adam Smith says, each individual is continuously exerting himself to find the most advantageous employment of whatever capital he can command. So whatever money, whatever resources you have at your disposal, you are going to be the best individual of how to use those resources to benefit yourself but also benefit society. Individuals doing that in a decentralized fashion, i.e. only looking out for themselves, engaging in self-interest, Smith thinks when we extend that out collectively to a society as a whole, it leads to positive net outcomes for the entire society. So through individuals pursuing their self-interest in a decentralized fashion, society arrives at the most efficient, the least wasteful production and allocation of its resources. People need to produce things that society wants in order to survive. So we need wages, we need profits. And the only way that we can do that is to figure out what society wants and provide it. And if we're unsuccessful or we provide something that no one wants, survival, ultimately, for Smith, will compel us to shift towards something that society does want. So markets, which are interactions between the producers of a good and the consumers of a good, they're going to push us to provide something as efficiently as we can so that society as a whole will benefit. Society as a whole can ultimately reap the benefits of our desire for self-preservation. So we call that idea the invisible hand, right? And you'll often hear this when we talk about the capitalist economy. There's this naturally occurring invisible hand, and it's going to incentivize behavior for the good of society, and ultimately it's going to correct decisions which do not provide for the good of society. So if you're producing something or you have skills that don't benefit society, you won't be rewarded for them. Markets will not create rewards for you. So capitalism really, in a lot of ways, it's about creating reward structures that benefit the individual but also benefit society as a whole. And markets, the way that Smith conceives of them and the way that most capitalists conceive of markets, again, markets as relationships between producers and consumers, markets are viewed as automatic. They're self-adjusting, right? So if you go off and you get a degree in political science and there's not a demand for the skills that you have, you'll find some other set of skills, you'll educate yourself, and you'll figure out what you can do in order to survive, in order to have a job and collect a wage. And that doesn't necessarily require excessive government intervention. That's an automatic self-adjusting process. That's you figuring out what you need to do in order to survive. And there's a naturally occurring incentive there for you to produce what society needs. Okay. A second really core idea that we see in capitalism is the idea of division of labor. And division of labor really arises out of a desire for efficiency. And capitalism prides itself on its efficiency. So the idea is that we're all locked into a system of exchange with other individuals, and we want to provide those individuals with what they want, and they want to consume what they need. But there's this consideration of efficiency. In order to provide as much of a desired good as possible, we need to organize ourselves in a fashion that enables us to produce that good at the lowest cost possible. And so we need to figure out a way that we can do that. We need a model for how we can set up production in such a way that we can efficiently produce what society needs and reap the benefits from that. And previously in human history, the way that production had been organized was kind of a craftsman model. You might have some exposure to this, like if you've taken history courses in which they talk about apprenticeships, right? Apprenticeships, you had a master craftsman who had a shop, right? And often the shop was attached to their home. And they would have individuals who would work for them and not really collect very much in terms of a wage, but they would gain certain skills, and they would go on to become a master craftsman. And the craftsman, if we're talking, say this is a carpenter, right? And this is a master craftsman carpenter. And he makes tables and chairs and things that are really, really well built and well valued. Well, they're going to oversee that productive process, the process of making a table from step 1 to step 10, however many steps it takes to produce the final product. But they start with the raw material and they go through every step of the process to create something exquisite and well designed and beautiful and functional, right? And that is a model that produces incredibly high quality goods, right? And to some extent we still value that. We will pay for certain goods that are handmade and we know that they're quality and they tend to be more expensive, but we're willing to pay it. But it's not a model that is very efficient in terms of large scale production, right? So, certain luxury cars, that car is basically assembled by a small team of experts, and it's not made on an assembly line. And so they're a lot nicer, but they're also significantly more expensive, and there aren't a lot of them because you simply can't produce a on a mass scale using that model. But the craftsman model was the dominant model of economic production at the time that Adam Smith was writing. And he recognized that if we were going to provide goods that society desired in the volume that was necessary, right, we would need to move away from this. We would need to figure out another way to organize economic production that was more efficient and could produce more goods. And the idea that he advances, and he did not come up with this. As I said earlier, he was seeing this in place in other economic enterprises. He was touring factories in which individuals were already doing this. But the model that he comes up with is a division of labor. So the tasks associated with the production of a product become divided. And he uses this example of pins, because he had toured a pin factory. Again, this gives you a sense of how eccentric Adam Smith was, that he could tour a pin factory, and he thought that was incredibly exciting. But he was excited because he saw the division of labor at work. He saw the division of tasks associated with the final product at work. So in this alternative model, the division of labor, you assign individuals very specific, very narrow tasks of the productive process. One individual draws out the wire for the pin. Another straightens it. Another cuts it. Another grinds it. Another packages the final product, etc., etc., etc. And so you divide the tasks associated with producing a single product, and as a result, because labor has become more specialized, and because all of the goods, all of the tasks associated with making a good are being divided up and being parceled out to certain individuals, you're able to produce at a much higher volume. You can produce a lot more goods. And this leads to a productive explosion, right? Goods become cheaper, more goods become available, and Smith would assert that society as a whole benefits. And this particular model of labor would be integrated into the industrial revolution. If you think of the factory floor by the late 19th or the early 20th century, it's basically, we're moving towards an assembly line model where individual laborers, individual factory workers are performing a very limited task, and they're doing it over and over and over again. But the end result of that is that you can produce on a much larger scale. And that's what he means by the division of labor, and ultimately he argues that is a beneficial thing for society. It's the only way that society can produce goods as efficiently as they need to in order to provide individuals with what they need, right? So this is a beneficial step for society as a whole. Another foundational principle of capitalism is the idea of exchange. So again, this is moving away from an older model of human production and kind of an older economic model, a subsistence model. So arguably one way that you could go about getting the things that you need is to try and produce everything you need. And if you've ever gone to like a living history museum, right? Living history is that it's kind of cheesy, but you go to these places and they have some replica of what life was like, say, during the colonial period in America, and you get to see people, producing certain things. You get to see what a colonial household looks like. But that is kind of, that's like a subsistence model. One of the very time-consuming things about life during that period is that everybody was trying to provide all of the things that they needed for the household, all of the goods that they needed themselves. So they were making their own food, making their own clothes. They were engaged in subsistence agriculture. They were fixing the machines that they used to farm. And the household was really, that was the setting in which all of the productive tasks associated with society emanated out of the household. And you would only go to a blacksmith or a carpenter when you needed something exceptional, but you tried to do all that work yourself. And that subsistence model, Smith says, ultimately it's really inefficient. One, if you're trying to produce everything for yourself, you probably don't possess the skills required to do so, right? So you don't have the skills to do that. And even if you theoretically could do that, if you could produce everything that you needed and wanted yourself, you're never going to be able to produce all of those things as well as someone that specializes in the provision of a single good, right? So somebody that specializes in how to produce a certain good and sets up a division of labor to enable them to produce it in significant volume. So arguably, and this is a core idea of capitalism, arguably what needs to happen if everyone's needs and everyone's desires are going to be fulfilled is you need exchange. This is the best route for the individual. It's also the best path for the society. And the means by which we do this is specialization. We focus on the production of a single good, and we try to do it very, very well. And then we engage in exchange. We find some medium of exchange and interact via trade to get the things that we need. And we see this today played out on a global scale, right? The U.S. used to be a manufacturing-based economy, and we have transitioned away from that. We've said, okay, in the global economy, there are certain countries which can manufacture goods and do so more cheaply than we can, and so we should move to a service-based economy. So the chances that you will graduate from college and you will go off and get a job in a factory engaged in manufacturing are fairly slim. And more likely, you'll be involved in some aspect of the service economy. You'll go work for a government bureaucracy, or you'll get a job in IT, or human resources, or some sort of administrative capacity, right? That is now, we've taken that idea of specialization and it's played itself out on a global scale where we have certain areas of the world that are basically the manufacturing centers, and other areas of the world that are service centers or finance centers, right? But it's all premised on the idea of exchange and the idea that we don't attempt to fulfill all of our needs ourselves, but we engage in exchange in order to meet our own needs, our individual needs, but also societal needs more efficiently. So this is Smith's framework, his philosophical framework, extended now globally. And the means by which an individual does something well, for Smith, it's not natural, right? So you are not naturally predestined to perform a certain role in the economy. It's acquired. So we acquire the skills that we need to be effective participants in a capitalist economy through custom and through habit and through education. And that too, that's very much an Enlightenment idea, right? An individual's role in the world, the role that they'll play in the economy, it's not fixed, it's something malleable. And through education, through socialization, you can change your role in the world. Okay, so exchange is another core idea of the capitalist economy. We also have to figure out, if we're going to have a capitalist economy, how to determine the value of a good or a service. And in a capitalist economy, basically this comes down, at least in its ideal form, as Smith is laying it out, it comes down to labor, right? It's really determined by labor. So the more labor that it takes to turn raw materials into a commodity, a good that people value, and it has actual use, we can use it for something, the more that product ought to cost, right? So Smith makes a distinction between what he calls the real value and the nominal value The real value of a good is, Smith says, this is the quality of the necessities of life which are given for a product. So the idea is that when we engage in labor, we're giving up necessities. We're giving up some sort of, ultimately we're giving up free time, and we're expending energy to produce something. And that is what ought to drive the real value of the good. So if something is super labor intensive and requires a lot of expertise and a lot of energy to produce, it ought to have a higher value. But the problem is we need something to facilitate exchange, right? And this is what he calls the nominal value of the good. How much we're willing to pay for a product in whatever medium of exchange, or ultimately currency, that we're using. So in this sense, money in a capitalist economy, it has a purely instrumental value, right? Money is simply the means by which we recognize and we reward the hardship, the sacrifice associated with the act of production. So money is something which facilitates exchange, but money is kind of not an end in itself. It's something which enables us to produce more efficiently, and it's just a medium that facilitates the capitalist process. Okay, but this distinction between real value and nominal value is important. A core aspect, a core driver of capitalism, one of the things that makes it so successful as an economic system, according to Smith, is the mechanism of profit, right? So Smith takes up the question in The Wealth of Nations of the philosophical basis for profit. And what's important to keep in mind here, and this is one of the areas in which you have to think back to Smith's context and kind of take yourself out of the capitalist society in which you reside. But profit is ultimately something, at the time that Smith is writing, it's something that needs philosophical justification. Like, profit for us has become second nature. We can't imagine in engaging in any sort of economic, investment or enterprise without there being the promise of profit. But you could envision, right, if you just kind of engage in a thought experiment, you could envision ways in which profit would not exist, right? Why should there be profit? If you get what you put in, why are you owed anything else as a result of that initial investment you made, right? Or why should individuals have any expectation of profit? Why are they owed? So why are investors owed profit, and why should they expect it? And Smith says there's basically two reasons for this, right? And the first is risk. So in a capitalist economy, there's a significant amount of risk anytime you make an investment. Anytime you do something in a capitalist economy, you produce a product or you seek training, right? You're taking a chance. It's basically like society-wide gambling, right? So right now you're taking a chance that gaining a college education will make you more marketable to employers and you'll get a job as a result of your university education. But that's not assured, right? That is a chance. You're making an investment. You're hoping that there's a payoff. All of the evidence suggests there is a payoff, but it's not guaranteed. If you invest in a product, say you have a friend who is an innovator and an inventor, and they have a great idea for a product and they want to set up a business, and they've been thinking about it a lot, and they have a business plan, and they come to you and ask for an investment, right? They say, I have this great idea, but I don't have the money to get it off the ground, but if you invest in this product, if you kind of take this leap with me, I think we'll make a lot of money and we'll be really successful, and people will want to produce our good. Well, you're taking a huge risk there, right? You're taking a chance that in the end, the product, whether the product be a new business or the product be a new commodity, some new product that nobody had ever heard of before, or the product be you as an individual, whether investing in certain skills and certain training will benefit you as an individual, you're taking a chance that the product will not find a buyer. So maybe that business fails. Maybe the market for that product that you're creating does not exist. Maybe the skills and the training that you gained in a university never result in employment. They're not the skills and training that are in demand. In that case, if that were to happen, you would be worse off than before. And you're always running that risk in a capitalist economy. You're always running the risk of making an investment and being worse off than you were before. And so, excuse me, and so part of what we do with investment is we try to reward the investor for that risk, because that risk is ultimately what drives the economy. It's what makes the economy grow. It's what makes the economy function effectively. There will not be new products. There will not be innovation. There will not be technological advancement. Solutions to societal problems will not be met if there's not a way to reward the investor for that risk. So new drugs won't be developed. New technologies won't be created if we can't reward the investor for the risk that they're taking. So that's part of it, right? That's part of the philosophical justification for profit. The second justification for profit is the benefit to society, right? Smith argues that ultimately, by investing in a productive act and producing something for consumers, the investor is helping society satisfy its needs, potentially, if the individual has accurately assessed what society's needs are. So it is completely legitimate that that individual should be rewarded for that action, and they should be rewarded for risking wealth and risking economic security to ultimately assist society in meeting its needs and achieving its desires. They're increasing the pool of goods and the pool of services upon which society can depend. And if we don't create an incentive for that, that activity doesn't happen. So if there is not profit, Adam Smith would argue, or a capitalist would argue, you don't end up with things like the internet, cell phones, computers, pharmaceutical, cures for diseases. All of these things require profit. They require individuals to expect to be rewarded, and to expect to be rewarded virtually without limit. If you create a great product, you should be heavily, heavily rewarded for the benefit that you've introduced to society. So that may seem like second nature to us, right? That because we're so ingrained with kind of the capitalist ethos, that mentality should be self-evident to us because we've lived and experienced that mentality. But at the time that Adam Smith was writing, it was not. He had to make a case for this. He had to create a philosophical justification for the expectation of profit, right? Lastly, this is kind of the last aspect of Adam Smith, what he lays out in this excerpt from The Wealth of Nations. We have to get into what this means in terms of government, right? So we've been laying out basically the capitalist doctrine and what it means for the economy and some very important language and ideas associated with it. But what is this going to mean in terms of how we set up our government? Well, it has interesting implications for that. The implication here, at least with regard to the economy, is that much of the decision making, many of the really important, influential, consequential decisions that are made with regard to economic life can be performed by individuals. So again, those ideas, those decisions about production, allocation, consumption, the individual can do that. And that implies that the government role should be fairly minimal. So if markets, right, which are driven by individual decision making, if markets are self-correcting, then basically any attempt to alter those relationships of production and consumption could actually undermine the invisible hand. It could actually disrupt the naturally occurring system of incentives that exists in a market economy, that exists in a capitalist economy. So that could be things like subsidies, that could be things like selective taxation, or the state owning an economic enterprise. We don't see this so much in the United States anymore, but there are many countries in which lots of important economic enterprises are owned by the government, not private entities. So the utilities might be owned by the government. One example that you could think about in the United States, if, for example, is the Postal Service, right? The Postal Service is, I mean, that's an economic enterprise. It's owned by the United States government, and capitalists would look at it and say, well, it operates very inefficiently because it's owned by the government, and it could be replaced by private entities. We have FedEx, we have UPS, right? Why do you need this government-owned entity to provide this important societal good, shipping and mailing goods, right? Why not transfer that to these private corporations that have demonstrated over decades that they can do a very, very good job at transferring goods from one place to another, right? The capitalist argument is that government tends to get in the way of the economy, and so the government's role should be fairly minimal. But Adam Smith does allow for some basic duties of government. There are some things which he says that this is an essential role of the government, and even within a capitalist model, right, this should be provided by the government. So there's three basic duties of the government, or as he calls it, the sovereign. The first is to protect society as a whole from violence and invasion. This is something that it's the government's responsibility to do it. So that means internal law and order. There should be a police force, and it also means the maintenance of a military. You need to protect yourself from foreign invasion. That's not something that can be effectively done by the market. That's a core task and responsibility of the government. So we're not going to have a private police force. We're not going to have a private military, and there's no way to really create a price and incentive structure for the provision of those goods. That's simply something that the government has to do, and it's the government's responsibility to ensure that it's there. And in a way, having a successfully functioning economy depends upon this action, right? If you have a society that's vulnerable to foreign invasion, or if you have a society in which internal law and order has broken down, then there's all sorts of economic implications of that. It means that whatever anyone would produce would be uncertain. If you produce this wonderful, incredible product, but then your society ends up being ripped apart by war, there's less of an incentive for others to produce that product. And so if the economy is to function and innovation is to happen, you need to have the government fulfilling that role. The second duty of the government is to protect members of the society from injustice or the oppression of every other member within it. Basically, what this means for Smith is some system of basic rights, freedom from arbitrary imprisonment, right to life and your property. But there should be some basic framework of rights, and it's the government's responsibility to enforce that. Right? They are the entity which ensures that justice and your basic rights are protected. And then, lastly, and this is kind of an interesting one, but he says the government has the responsibility to erect and maintain public works and public institutions, things that we all benefit from, society's basic infrastructure. So these would be things like roads, bridges, technology to a certain extent. There are certain things which the government is going to invest in, and that provides the basis for economic growth and the basis for an economy to thrive and grow and prosper. And there's not necessarily an incentive for private actors to create those things. So if we think of like the highway system, for example, I mean, that is created and that's maintained by state and federal governments, right? And it would be really hard to imagine how you would set that up in such a way that it was privately owned. If there was, a big U.S. corporation that was going to oversee the road system and charge people to use it, it would be difficult to do. It wouldn't be impossible, but it would be problematic, right? And so Smith thinks that there's certain instances in which, yeah, it's reasonable to expect that the government is going to step in and they're going to provide this role. And much of what's happening in the economy, the economic realm, depends upon those things. You need roads to transport your products. You need certain basic functions if the economy is going to successfully provide for everyone's needs. Okay, but that's really it, and that's a fairly minimalistic conception of government, right? It's protecting individuals from violence and invasion, protecting their basic rights, and there's some minimal things that the government's going to have to do in terms of public works to provide for the economy, but that's it. And if you think about some of the more expansive functions of government, things like welfare, healthcare, providing public education, right? Maybe you can make the case that those are key public institutions that need to be created and maintained for the economy to function. But the traditional way in which Adam Smith has been interpreted is that they're not, that that's government excess. That's government stepping in and providing things that could be more effectively provided by private entities, by corporations and businesses. Okay. Lastly, there's there's one final thing that Smith notes that's really important, and it's central to the capitalist notion of how government ought to be set up. And you hear this discourse constantly, particularly you hear it from the Republican Party in this country, is the danger of excess taxation, right? Smith argues that the government, even though he recognizes the government is going to have to do certain things, and it's very important that they fulfill those roles, he says the government has to be really careful not to tax individuals excessively in order to do that. So the government is going to need revenue, right? They need revenue to perform those basic functions, but they have to ensure that they don't tax individuals too much in order to do this. And he says there's 4 real important reasons why this is the case. One, it requires a costly bureaucracy. Taxation is complex and it's universal, and so you need really an army of civil servants and agents to effectively tax a society. And so you create this big, powerful bureaucracy, and Smith is going to be a little uneasy with that. It's costly, and it's you're creating a power center that's kind of dangerous. Okay. 2, he says it obstructs industry. There is less incentive to produce if the profits which you're going to gain from production are going to be subject to excessive taxation. So ultimately, taxation will drive down the incentive to innovate and create new things. He says individuals, right? Again, he kind of accepts individuals as they are and recognizes that they're self-interested. And he says there are going to be individuals who try and evade taxes if they're too high, right? That will just happen. Tax evasion is an enormous crime in the United States. Lots of people engage in tax evasion when they don't want to pay the taxes that are owed to the government. And he says that is problematic. People will try to do it, and ultimately they will fail, right? If you're administering this effectively, individuals are going to try and engage in tax evasion. They'll be found out. They'll be fined. They'll go to jail. And there is a productive individual. There is a smart individual who could be doing something productive for society, and instead they're being punished and they're being jailed, right? So you're paying to put them in jail, and they're not contributing anything to society when they do that. They're not contributing to the wealth of a nation when they're in jail for tax evasion. So that's kind of self-defeating. And if the government sets taxes low enough at a rate which they're reasonable, then that won't happen. And lastly, and this is really interesting to think about in terms of when The Wealth of Nations was written, He says taxation can create animosity towards government, and ultimately it can lead to political instability. Now, The Wealth of Nations was written in 1776. One of the core grievances of the American colonists who were, essentially launching their revolt against the British monarchy in 1776, one of their core grievances was taxation. They felt that they were not given enough say in terms of how their tax revenue was used, and that taxation was too excessive. And so ultimately they thought the relationship that the American colonies had with the British monarchy was one of economic exploitation. And so there was huge animosity towards government and political authority, which at that time was the British monarchy. And ultimately it led in Britain losing its American colonies, losing this tremendous, tremendous set of resources that could have been theirs had they not engaged in excessive taxation. So Smith argues that excessive taxation can actually be self-defeating for government. And it runs a continuum, right? It can be self-defeating in the sense that it's costly and eats up a lot of your resources, but it can go as far as political instability. It can go as far as revolution if your taxes are too excessive, right? It can actually lead to the downfall of your government. So that's Smith's minimalistic conception of what government ought to be doing in a nutshell. And that idea of a minimalist government that provides space for the economy to function on its own and doesn't engage in excessive taxation, that is discourse that's pervasive in American politics. You see it everywhere. You see this notion of taxes are too high, the government is inefficient, the government should have a minimal role. You really encounter that in American politics quite a bit. So Adam Smith's influence then is huge, particularly in our own society. And what's important to keep in mind is that he is writing at a stage in human history when capitalism doesn't really exist. He is writing in a pre-capitalist stage. The things that he is suggesting that now are part of our everyday lives only exist in really embryonic form at the time he's writing in the late 18th century. But capitalism becomes an incredibly powerful force in politics, domestically and in world politics, in the late 19th and eventually the 20th centuries. Many societies in the world, most, if not all, societies in the world today practice some variant of capitalism. Almost all societies have some, even if it's imperfect, they have some version of the market operating within their societies. And it shapes really fundamental confrontations that happen in the 20th century and also in our contemporary time. The Cold War, which I think we mentioned this when we were talking about Isaiah Berlin and his piece in our very first lecture, Does Political Theory Still Exist? The Cold War was a confrontation basically between two competing economic systems. Globalization today, many of the folks who are resisting globalization or protesting globalization do so on the grounds that they think it is taking Western-style capitalist ideas and implanting them in vulnerable and easily exploited areas of the world. So the globalization movement is driven by a reaction to, or the anti or alter globalization movement is driven by a reaction to capitalism, a negative reaction to capitalism. And certainly in the U.S. today, with, for instance, the collapse of some financial and insurance companies, that has brought this renewed questioning of the principles of non-interference, the principles of self-correcting markets. There was this discourse in the context of the early stages of the economic crisis in 2008 and 2009. There was this discourse of too big to fail, right? That certain corporations, certain economic actors were simply too big and too powerful and too important to let them fail. And so we essentially gave over $1 trillion to corporations in the United States that were in trouble. And that has brought a new focus on these questions of non-interference and self-correcting markets. Following Smith's model closely, we would say that there shouldn't be any entity in the economy that's too big to fail. If an economic actor is not functioning efficiently and it gets itself into economic trouble or it's making bad decisions, you let it fail. And that's productive. That helps the capitalist economy in the long run. But that is not what we've seen in terms of our response to the financial crisis. And many people are saying that the problem with why we've seen these recent economic troubles is because we've followed Adam Smith's model too closely. That we do not intervene to the extent that we should in regulating and confronting powerful economic actors, right? So we don't ensure that they're not doing things that are dangerous or fraudulent or somehow negative. And so we actually need to move away from this model of non-interference and introduce new forms of regulation if we're not going to be facing this same problem in the future. So, and lastly, and I mentioned this at the outset, but we're having this debate about inequality, right? And inequality from a capitalist perspective is not necessarily a problem. Inequality signifies that some individuals have made good decisions and they've been rewarded, and other individuals have not made good decisions and they have not been rewarded, and that's okay. Capitalist discourse is pretty accepting of the idea that there's going to be inequalities, and that can actually operate as an incentive for innovation and growth, right? But we're engaged in the society-wide debate right now about how much inequality is too much. When should we confront inequality and attempt to redistribute wealth or decrease the gap between the very, very rich and the very, very poor? And that's an open debate with very, very different perspectives on how you approach that problem. So the debate over the principles laid out by Adam Smith, hundreds of years ago, rages on, and many see capitalism as really the only justifiable system of economic organization, and others see it as a deplorable doctrine that relegates man's ability to survive on how well he can sell himself, right? And I don't think we'll ever have a definitive answer in terms of what is right. This is one of those essentially contested questions that we will continue to debate. But Smith's influence really can't be overstated. He created the architecture for a new way of structuring the economy, and that has been disseminated globally, and we see it in practice in every corner of the world. So today's video clip, some of you will probably have seen this. It's from the film Wall Street. Wall Street came in. The movie was produced at a time that that capitalist discourse was really thriving in the United States. I think it came out in 1987, and Ronald Reagan was president, and there was this very individualistic, very capitalistic culture that had taken hold in the United States. And there were folks who were wealthy, folks who were thriving, and they kind of didn't. There was a mentality in the 1980s that wealth was not something that anyone should be ashamed of. That wealth ultimately is, you should be proud if you're wealthy, and you should flaunt your wealth because it means that you've succeeded in the American economy. And so this clip from Wall Street is a very famous speech by the key protagonist in the movie, Gordon Gekko, and he is saying essentially greed is good, right? He praises self-interest, he praises greed, he says it's an engine for social and economic progress. And so take a look at this clip, and then I'd be interested in your thoughts on the discussion board in light of recent events, in light of the economic situation today, and some of the economic challenges that we face, do we still believe this? And also, I'd be interested in the extent to which you think it lines up with what Adam Smith is saying. Do you think this is an accurate portrayal of what Adam Smith is saying in The Wealth of Nations, which is kind of the core document for the foundations of the capitalist economic system? So this lecture is the last lecture that you'll have before the midterm exam. There's no reading or lecture for tomorrow. You have kind of a free day. There's no reading. You don't have to watch a lecture or prepare for anything. And I give that day to you so that you can review for the exam. The study guide is available on the First Class site. You can consult it if you haven't already. And I will also be available during my virtual office hours or via email if you have any questions about the exam. The exam is, I've been over this before, but there is a link on the First Class site that takes you to Blackboard, and the exam is administered through the Blackboard site. So once you go to the Blackboard site, once you click that link, it will take you to the exam. The exam will be available on 6/13 from midnight until 10 p.m. So there's 22 total hours that you could take the exam. Once you click that link, right, and you can click that link, on Blackboard to take the exam at any point from midnight to 10 p.m. on the 13th. You have 90 minutes to complete the exam, which should be more than enough time to complete the exam. But just keep that in mind, that you have 90 minutes. You won't be shut off. It doesn't kick you out after 90 minutes, but along with everyone's exam answers, I get a log of how long it took you to complete the exam. And so if it's over 90 minutes, then you'll be subject to point deductions. But that should be more than enough time. Just ensure that once you click on the exam, you have 90 minutes that you can kind of focus and zero in on the exam and be able to get it done in that time frame. And also remember that the test does not cover up to Adam Smith. It only covers up to, I believe, Machiavelli in terms of the material that we've covered thus far in the course. Right. So please feel free to consult me during office hours if you have any questions, or via email. I'm happy to go over anything that you want to review or things that you see on the study guide that you think aren't clear. And we pick up after you take the midterm exam with Karl Marx. And so that's kind of the other side of the coin. We've laid out the capitalist system, which and you're very familiar with. But Marx is really, he's laying out the socialist alternative. This is some of the core philosophical work that's making an argument that we should approach the economy in a different way and have a different set of goals and objectives and guiding motivations that structure our economic life. So that's where we will pick up after the exam. And as I said, feel free to consult me in the interim if you have any questions about the exam. Okay, so I will see you then, and we'll move on to Marx at that point. Thanks.